Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal's Polyglot Software Development Podcast. Our guest today is Austin Reed. Austin is a full time digital nomad for the last 8 years. In that time, he's been to over 26 countries all over South America, Europe, and Asia. Austin's gone from sleeping on the street to losing all his income to flourishing and everything in between. Austin runs a software development agency where he helps businesses automate their processes, build websites and apps. He's a musician and a Muay Thai practitioner. Austin loves food, cooking, travel, and meeting new people. Austin, again, thanks for taking time to having a chat with me here.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here.
My apologies for doing this again. Folks, I know I forgot to use my mic the first time, so just repeating some part of this. My apologies to Austin. But Austin, if you could introduce in your own words a little. I know I read out the description, but if you could just speak to who you are, where you live, and what you do, so the audience will get more acquainted with you before we start this conversation.
Sure thing. So, yeah, my name is Austin Reed. Currently, I'm in Buenos Aires in Argentina. I've been here for almost a year now, which is one of the longer bouts. Usually, I change countries once about every 3 to 6 months. So, it's kind of weird for me to be in the same place for such a long time. I run a software development agency, Horizon Dev. And basically, what we do, like you said, is we do automations and dashboards and integrate AI for internal and external apps for small to medium sized businesses. And yeah, I do love cooking. I do love Muay Thai. I am a musician as well. I have some music on Spotify, and yeah, I just like meeting new people and having a good time. Yeah.
Thank you for the introduction. So the topic for today, I know we had a few topics. The one we're going with is balancing entrepreneurship with the nomadic lifestyle. I think of the topics that you recommended, all of them are interesting, but this one picked my interest because given the day and age we live in, people are wanting to travel. I don't travel much at all, but I know people who actually love traveling, like the flexibility of being able to travel and work out of different locations, right? So I think that kind of struck a chord with me. So let's talk about that. And in the context of where we are at today as people and YouTube and folks actually making a living off of YouTube and doing all of the travels, I think it's a good conversation to have. So uh, balancing, I mean, what does it mean? I mean, for starters, right? For someone like me who lives in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., works out of here, does minimalistic travel, not much. I've done some travel during the course of my life, but don't enjoy flying, certainly not coach. Until we get to a point where I can afford business class, I've just not done as much travel as I would otherwise like to. But with that said, I enjoy travel content. I watch a lot of it on YouTube. So, what does it mean? There's plenty of things I want to ask you here, but what was one of the reasons that you decided to actually live a nomadic lifestyle outside of, sure, I bet you enjoy travel, which is probably the core part of it, but that apart, were there other aspects of travel or wanting to not be based out of a single location that kind of encouraged you to take picking up this as a way to live life?
Well, to to be frank, it kind of happened by accident. So, when I was a teenager, I went for a foreign exchange year in Germany. And while I was there, I made a friend. And back then, my dream was to do music, to play concerts all across the world. And I met a friend there who was from Argentina, which surprisingly I'm here now, which is kind of ironic. But he had the same dream as me, and so the plan was he would come to the U.S. later on, and we would try to tour U.S. and stuff. But that never happened. Fast forward like 6, 7 years, like I am in university, and he's not gonna come. Right? I realized that. So then I decided that I would go down to Argentina, and so I took the first step. I sold my car. It was a big deal at the time because it's like I had nowhere really to even stay or go. I didn't speak Spanish, right? Now I do. Big difference. um, and so it was really hard that first move. But from there, it just kind of snowballed into like I've been traveling ever since then because I met my ex wife in Argentina and then we traveled the Amazon River from Ecuador all the way to the coast of Brazil. And then, from there, we went all over. And after that, you just kind of get used to it. It just becomes part of life, kind of in a way, to be honest. Yeah.
Wow, that's good. I know I've not had. I've certainly love to go to South America. I watched a lot of travel content based out of South. I even recently saw a documentary about a ship traveling across the Amazon. It was very interesting. So some of what you tell me, it's not. I'm able to imagine it as well. So let's cut to. So you travel, and you said you've not been, being in the same place for over years is out of the ordinary for you. So you've
Yeah.
traveled quite a bit and quite frequently. How do you manage your, like, for folks who want to do this, the next generation of people that I talk to certainly enjoy travel, and obviously all of us have to do something to, if travel is, you're able to make a living by traveling, like on YouTube, that's a different story. But for most of the people, you travel, but you're still doing something outside of, your monetization doesn't come from travel, but you're traveling while actually working and doing whatever it is that you do. Uh, what does it mean to manage work? For folks who are wanting to do this, what are some of the things that you'd, before we even taking your example of running a software development agency, what does it mean to run one where you're located, you're in one place, all of your coworkers are co-located, and then you go to work, maybe even you have a physical office, and then you go there and you're getting stuff done, versus how you're doing it today, where I presume you and the rest of your team is I reckon remote as well, Austin. So what are some differences and challenges, and what are some positives that you bring, that this this approach brings to the table from a client standpoint?
Well, I haven't worked in person at a company for about 10 years. So, and that was my second job. So that was a long time ago. But what I remember then was you could just tap somebody on the shoulder if you needed help, and they'd be right there to help you. And you had this sort of camaraderie with your teammates, right? Now, that camaraderie doesn't exactly go away, but it definitely does change. Us within our company, like our CTO and our CEO, they all live here in Buenos Aires with me. So we all travel together, the three of us. Everybody else is remote. I mean, we're remote too because we travel countries as well. But it is a lot different because, like, we give our team members more freedom to work, so it's not like a 9 to 5, like, hey, you need to be at work at 9 and clock out at 5. It's not like that. We do something called flex time, where we have like a portion of their day where, like, 2, 3, 4 hours, depending on the team and the project and how important it is, where they have to be available. And then outside of that, they can work whenever they want. They can work on Saturday, they can work in the morning, they can work at night. And if they need something from anybody of the team, they can just message in one of our Discord channels, same thing as Slack, right? And one of the team members will respond to them. That being said, what we found is, by building a very team oriented environment, that our coworkers, our team members, are still forming those bonds that you would find in a more in-person situation, right? So we've actually found that a lot of them actually do chat. Some of them play video games together, and they do other things together as well outside of work, which, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily think so if you were working remotely, but we do find that those bonds do get built as well.
You know, you'd be preaching to the choir, because I've been working remotely for 15 years. I think it's the last time I was at a physical location has been, it was eons ago. So I exactly understand what you're saying, right? And I couldn't, even if I wanted to disagree, there's no aspect of what you just told me that I could, because that's literally how our team functions as well. And I think I don't, even before the pre-pandemic, I mean, like you said, you've been working remotely for years. Me too, a bit longer. I'm just older than you. uh, I always felt like, being able to have the freedom and provide the freedom to the rest of the team members to able to do the work was when it suited them best, outside of those core hours that you mentioned, bode well in general and specifically for productivity. And it took a bit for, I think, the world to recognize that. Sure, I mean, everything is not without its due share of challenges, but that apart, I think this system works perfectly fine. I mean, it's got its own share of challenges, and I want to talk about some of those. So your clients, Austin, say, are they located like in the US, or are they all over the globe? Like, where is the main concentration of your clients?
90% of them are based in the US, and then a small percentage are around Europe.
Okay, so which means the time zone probably like I'm guessing, are you close to the US Eastern time zone?
Yeah, I'm 1 hour difference. So I'm an hour
Okay, yep.
ahead of you guys. Yeah.
Because I've worked with somebody out of Argentina in one of my projects, and remember vividly that, we didn't have to make any accommodations for time because it was pretty close, which makes it super convenient, right? Extremely convenient in whether folks are on the West Coast or the East Coast. Working with folks in South America is fun for more than one reason. I worked with people in Colombia,
Mm,
I mean, again, North America as well. So Mexico, then mostly Colombia, Argentina, and
hmm.
Brazil. I want to
That's
say,
cool.
and there might have been one more country if I'm forgetting. It's I come from India, and I noticed that culturally, there's a lot of cultural similarities between people in South America. As geographically apart as those continents are, I noticed a ton of similarities, except maybe for the vegetarian food part. I know
Yeah.
all the people I worked with were not particularly into vegetarian food, but it was awesome. The fact that the time zones weren't different actually made it much easier. Now, you mentioned your clients are predominantly here. Also, what is the stack that you guys work on? Like, if you want to give a quick intro to the type of work you do from a technical standpoint, like what is it that you do?
Yeah. So we primarily work with Python, Django, React, Node stacks. And we don't do any mobile apps anymore, although we did at one time. We pivoted away from doing React Native. But yeah, we mostly do that type of stuff. Lots of work with AI, doing lane chain, things like that, working with large data sets, big databases, automating huge processes around. One of our bigger clients is VREF, and we're helping them rebuild their aircraft valuation system and integrating AI into it and stuff like that. So, really big projects. And I guess one of the other big things we really hit on is scraping. We're really good at taking data, like large amounts of data off the internet to be able to further analyze it. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned you don't do mobile apps anymore. So does it mean you work predominantly on building web apps at this point?
Yeah, that is correct.
And I presume you do both sides, right? The front end and the back end.
Yep.
Okay, so let's take an example, and I'm going to dig into the nomadic lifestyle, but in the context of work that you actually do. So
Okay.
let's say you have a team that's geographically dispersed as well, right? Your dev team, your team in general. Now, let's say we're going to take a very simple use case, because these are things that are the real life challenges that people do run into. I just want to get your 2 cents on how you and your team approach something like this. Say you're building a web app. Let's say it's a simple enough page. It does X, Y, and Z. It has some dependencies on the back end, and let's say you have an API developer or a team of developers that are building Graph or REST APIs, and they're all geographically dispersed, right? They're in different locations, different time zones. So you need to now build this. Your client needs a page. It needs to function. You mentioned you work on React. Let's say you're using React on the front end, and you're using one of your backend languages. Doesn't matter what it is. How do you so given this environment where people are working different times, different time zones, is a set of core hours, and assuming I'm making an assumption here that your team is separated by the front end and the back end, which could be wrong. And if it is, then I'll have to change my question. Is the same person building both sides of this stack, or is it two
No,
different sets of teams?
no, there are two different sets of people. We only have, I believe, one full stack guy outside of me and Mateos. We can also do full stack, but everybody else is either back end or front end. Yeah.
Perfect. So my question still stands good then. So let's pretend that Austin is the UI developer, works out of Argentina. Krish happens to live in the suburbs of DC, and I'm the backend engineer. And
Mhm.
we are part of the same team, same sprint team. For instance, we have a deliverable to the client. Let's say it's a 3-month project, and we're good. Now, how do you work? There are some that are going to be obvious here, but I also want to dig into the not so obvious. Given the fact that you would probably be building the pages, assuming certain dependencies from the backend team, and I would actually, it's slightly easier for the backend developer, a little bit harder for the front end, but regardless, I may or may not even need to know the page and the design, the UI, the UX, because my job is to actually, define a specification, give it to you, both of us in agreement, and then go build to my spec, and then, uh, you know, make the APIs available to you. So that's the basic problem. How in your organization do you go about it? What are some of the challenges you run into? What are things that typically go pretty smoothly, and what are things that have need to be ironed out every so often?
Got you, got you. Well, the first thing we'll do is we'll sit down with both teams and we'll plan out the project together with the team leaders, the team itself. We try to make everybody on the team have more of a leadership role, something that Jocko Willing talks a lot about. Just because we also want everybody on the team to grow over time. So if people take on responsibility as a leader throughout all ranks of the team, people tend to care more about their job, right? So we'll do that. We'll plan out some API schemas and some, general things like that. And then we'll do mock APIs. Sometimes we use Xano. I don't know if you've ever heard of Xano. It's good for quick and dirty mock APIs. Obviously, they're not functional and they don't work, but it's good enough for the front end team to be able to do integration without having the back end component already built. All you have to do is swap the main API URL, right? Then, as after that, I mean, we have our obviously weekly sprint meetups. Depending on the project, we might have daily meetups. If it's really, really complex and fast deadline type of project, if it's more easy, maybe we'll meet like twice a week, something like that. And then we have CI/CD. So on every single team, two people are responsible for every single code push. So one person reviews the push and approves it and pushes it to CI/CD. CI/CD will automatically reject it if there's any errors, so it will never get pushed to staging if there's any problems in the code. It will never break the staging. So that means that everybody on the team has some responsibility to a piece of code, and everybody on the team is responsible to push a little bit of code to the staging environment, which is good because that means the junior level developers get to read some senior level code and they can learn from it. And then senior level developers can read the junior level code and then help them correct some things here and there. And with them both being responsible, generally speaking, it goes pretty well. Problems that we have, I mean, yeah, we don't get this too often where but this does happen sometimes where like something's a little complicated and they need like some further clarification, and maybe that takes like a day or so to get that clarification back. Generally what we'll try to do in those situations is we'll try to do a Loom video, and the reason why is because those are asynchronous. We Yes, we do the sprint meetings, but we try to eliminate as many meetings as we can because like we don't want to disrupt people's day-to-day workflows. Most developers don't actually like to be on the call, let's be frank. So if we can just solve it with the Loom video, then we'll do that for sure.
Okay, so that's great. So my questions here based on what you just mentioned. You said you stub out the endpoints, right? So let's say I'm the API developer. I don't have these endpoints being functional, so it's stubbed out. You're getting these static responses. So you can start building to whatever it is that you're building. The questions I have in that regard, because we are a company that has many different products in production, Austin. One of the main things we do is build APIs, right? Our APIs are available on AWS and other marketplaces and API hubs for consumption. So people who want to actually build something, whether they prototype or whether they want to build something quick and dirty, or they want to go to production and actually use. The idea is to spend your energy building what your customer actually does need, whether it's your client
Mhm.
or your end consumer, and not have to worry about the back end heavy lifting, right? That's the entire rationale behind us publishing a suite of APIs, right? And there's a number of them where let's say there's a number of them. I'll share the link with you. But the question I'm trying to ask here is, I've we are a team of developers who's done this a while. So across languages, right? We have APIs built on Ruby, built on Golang, and we have a polyglot shop. But I know good engineers, folks who've done development for a while, UI engineers, who are not particularly comfortable working with stubbed out endpoints, right? They are like, hey, you know what? I know it works. I can get started and kind of get the ball rolling. I can get my UI-ish UX in place, but I'm not comfortable, not nearly as comfortable building without actual endpoints. And even if your endpoints don't are not completely entirely functional, then they might even be buggy. They don't have the security checks, whatnot. They're okay with that, but they do have this. I can tell you, explain more about why. But if that, I mean, first of all, before I go to the question, does it resonate with you? Or you're like, Krish, this is preposterous. I don't know of any UI developer who would actually not be inclined to using a stub.endpoint.
No, that makes sense. Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, so in that the reasons span the spectrum. I hardly ever agree with any of those reasons, to be honest, but I can see the other side because I'm a full stack engineer who does works on both sides. Your team, do they have any level of discomfort or concern saying, hey, you know what, yeah, you can give us a stub endpoint, Austin, but you'd really rather have a functional API? Depending on your answer, I have a follow-up question.
Well, to kind of preface this, a lot of our applications, some of the APIs actually repeat themselves. So we actually have API packs that we can just deploy that are alongside some of the mock stuff. So when the front end engineers actually start, they're working off the Figmas, they're working off, like all the payment gateways, all the subscription modules, all the things like that. That's copy, paste, repeat stuff for the most part. I mean, outside of, updating it every once in a while as languages change, right? So we can just one click deploy, generally speaking, about 40 to 60% of the back end that's going to end up being the final product. The rest is the icing on the cake, the actual functionality that makes the app different, right? Now, by the time the front end actually gets to the point to where they're integrating with the back end usually is already done anyway. So, I mean, there is that, but it also kind of depends too on how quick the project is and how many team members we have on it, which is why we do use the mock URLs as well.
Okay, so essentially the UI team is going to use your, whether it's a get, I mean, it works much easier for these get, when you're building UI pages with get requests. The times where I've seen it gets challenging for UI engineers is when you're working on a post
Post request,
patch
batch
put
request.
request,
Yeah.
because you're actually adding content or submitting or updating content, but your
Yep.
response obviously is stubbed out, right? So there are some nuances that they obviously have to deal with there. but but I guess from what I gather, your team is generally comfortable working with these stubbed out endpoints, and then at some point the API. So uh, typically, does again, this depends on every team, is the API ahead of the UI work, meaning uh,
Yeah.
they have the APIs, or is it the other way around?
Yeah. API is almost always ahead of UI.
Okay, so the UI team typically has what they're looking for the most part, right? They get started out with
Yeah.
stubbed out endpoints.
Yeah. I mean, occasionally there's bugs and stuff. I mean, there's always bugs and things that happen, but yeah, usually the UI is lagging behind.
And then, when as an API engineer, do they? I know this doesn't go into nomadic lifestyle, but when two engineers talk, sometimes you won't get into the weeds of what we are talking about here. My apologies if it's not digging deeper into the nomadic side of things, but surely we will. All of this is pertinent in that sense. Say I publish this endpoint, right? And where do I, as a UI engineer, am I is the UI as an API engineer? Sorry, I completed my work. I have it in my feature branch. I haven't, merged it into my dev branches, for instance. Do I deploy it in your world to a dev server before the UI team starts consuming the API, or do they just check out the branch and start consuming it even before the feature branch has been reviewed and merged?
Every single time, at least the way we operate, every single time a feature is built, it is automatically pushed to staging, no matter what. So staging is constantly being updated. That's why we have CI/CD in place. Because without
Okay.
CI/CD in place, that wouldn't be possible, because then things would become a huge mess, right? So nothing can be pushed to staging that would break the server. That being said, sometimes things do get pushed that would have a little bit of bugs here and there, but those are quickly found and flushed out.
Okay, but in other words, which means the UI team is never getting a feature branch saying, "Hey, Austin, I made a bunch of API changes. They're not ready yet to be deployed, to even the lower environments. So I'm not handing out the branch to you for you to check out the branch and build your UI pages against the branch which has not yet been deployed to the servers, right?"
No, that doesn't happen. No. What does happen is we do push out updates to our devs and also to clients sometimes if they request that as well. Whereas every time somebody does push to staging, there's a quick, update patch notes of what was changed. And obviously that's pinned to the code. So if the front end engineer did want to go see the back end code, which I'm not sure why, because we have API docs, they could do that. Yes.
Okay, but if they do find a bug, since given the separation that you mentioned here, the UI engineer is not actually saying, "Hey, I found an API issue. Let me quickly fix it." That's not what they're doing. They actually let the API team know for the API team to deal with that, and it
Yep.
has goes
Yeah,
through
yeah,
their
yeah, yeah.
cycles, right?
They'll let them know. So each team has a project leader, back end and front end for each project, right? And they're responsible for reporting that up to the project manager, and the project manager then distributes the flow amongst them of like, okay, well that bug's important, but we're going to wait to fix that until this is done, or whatever. If that makes sense.
Sure. And let's say, and I ask this from API standpoint because we work on different things at different points of time. But in the recent many months, our most of our focus has been actually building more APIs and making those APIs available on these platforms. Which is why I'm talking a little bit more about APIs. But feel free to change the conversation to a different aspect of the stack if that it's more interesting to you. Not a problem at all, right? So let's say the API team has to build. I mean, I'm taking REST as an example. If it's graph, it changes the conversation, but let's just keep it simple enough because even after many years, REST is still, for whatever reason, more popular than graph. So I'm just going to take a REST example. Say if your API team needs to build, let's say, a small number of endpoints, let's say 10 endpoints. How do they go about their approach? Forgetting the UI team, you've now given the requirements to your API team and they know that this is what they need to do. If you could just walk us through the process, then I can speak to how we do it and see, where there are differences
Oh, that
and
would
go
be
from
lovely.
there. Like, let's say, let's switch roles and let's say you are the API developer and I'm like, hey, this is the page I need to build. Uh, Here, this is the UI page. This is how the page looks like. And here is the requirements for the UI functionality. That's it. I haven't said, let's pretend I've never said the word API even once up until this point. who what is the role that you have in your company, in your organization, that comes into play here, that takes this UI page, maybe it's the UI engineer, maybe it's somebody else, and actually works with the API team to define what those endpoints should be, how they are written up, what the
Mm,
URLs look like, the entire process. All that we have assumed right now is like a single page. We know it's got a few buttons that need to be clicked and it does X, Y, and Z.
got you.
And now the API needs to get built. And they are again, a disparate team located someplace else, working different time zones. What is the process that you have in place for this to be facilitated?
Yeah, so all of most of these plans are actually done synchronously. So we don't do those separate. We all actually hop on a Discord call. Generally speaking, the project manager and the team lead of the backend team that was assigned to that project will meet together. They'll discuss the user bases, the different tables that might be involved in terms of creating these APIs, things like that, different functionalities involved. Then the backend team will go, the lead will go with his team,
Hey,
and
Austin,
they
sorry,
will,
I'm going to interrupt you there as you go, right? Because these
yeah,
are topics that are of immediate interest to our audience in general. We do have conversations outside of this core engineering on and off. Even topics that are outside of core engineering, like this nomadic lifestyle we start out with, it sort of changes quickly because this is literally what like the two are we all do for a living. So you mentioned tables. I want to say that's probably too is it too early in the game when you mentioned tables? I'm assuming you mentioned the database schema, right?
yeah, database schema, just the different tables in general. Like first, you need to know what accounts and user bases you have. I mean, without that, I mean, API is cool, but it like if you don't know who's using it, what permissions they have, and things like that. I mean, user base always goes first, at least in when we develop. Second, then it would be which tables, what would the tables possibly look like, and from there, how does the API endpoints look?
Yeah, but isn't that too early? Like, so it sounds to me like you guys are not into API first development in that sense, right? Because you are actually gone much deeper into the design in this initial conversation.
Well, it also depends on how complex the project is as well. Sometimes we'll just go straight to the API and then do the tables later. But with the more complex ones, generally we'll try to do the table structure first.
Okay, but the reason I'm asking that is, to me, if I'm the API developer and I have to implement something, I wouldn't talk tables for like for a while, right? Because in my mind, I want to know what the URLs are first of all. Let's say you have a bunch of requirements for that UI page to be implemented. The first thing that
Mhm.
I would assume is of immediate interest to me is what the definition of those REST URLs is. When we're assuming a REST API here.
Yeah.
So the first thing I want to know is what those 10 endpoints actually look like, right? Like, hey, is that a slash restaurant slash whatever? Is it a get request? Is it a post
Yeah.
request? Is it a put? Is it a patch? Because before I go any further, I want that contract to be ironed out between the UI and the API team, right? With zero implementation in place, I want at the end of that
Mhm.
call, I would want to know, hey, Austin, I have these endpoints. These are the 10 endpoints that actually you would need for your page. How you call them is left to you. How you wire them into your user interface is entirely up to you. That's not my headache or my problem as an API engineer. But I do need to confirm what those endpoints are and what the engagement between the two of us is, for instance, right? So I was just trying to understand who would actually go about defining those endpoints and how concrete they end up becoming at the end of those initial conversations. It's more like, hey, you know what, let's just take a stab at it, let's build it, this is the rough definition of those endpoints. Or are you an organization that goes, there's no right or wrong answer, that actually concretely irons out the details of each and every one of those endpoints, and then you can put that on Swagger or Apiary or wherever it is that you want to publish it before the UI team starts consuming. Like, where do you lean as an organization?
Yeah, well, like I said, so first thing we'll do is we'll gather all the information that would be involved in said APIs. We can't say these are the 10 endpoints we need without knowing what information is going to be within those endpoints, right? So first we'll define that, we'll define the user bases, we'll sit down and we'll make the tables and we'll make the API endpoints together. By the end of the API planning, at least in our organization, we not only have the API schema in Swagger, but we also have the table structure defined as well for the backend engineers so they can get started working. We do both of those processes together. That's just the way we've always done it. I don't know.
Okay, no, I mean, there's no, like I said, there's no right or wrong answer. The reason I was asking that is I've seen, the beauty of diversity is also, when people are located in different places, I've seen that the approach changes, even though, whether you're writing API code from Brazil, Argentina, or India, or the US or Europe, it really doesn't make any difference from a technical standpoint. But that's on paper, right? Having worked with folks across the globe during the course of my career, I can say with reasonable surety that how somebody approaches a problem is very much a product of their environment, the weather. When I open
Yeah.
my blinds, I'm not looking at a mountain. But if I were looking at a mountain, maybe I live in Colorado or something, right? Maybe I'm blessed to looking at better landscapes. All of this plays a role in how software does get built. Sadly, I don't see it being discussed enough or spoken enough. Especially when you're in a type of a contractual engagement, the tendency sometimes is, hey, you know what, we need to get this done. Let's build endpoints. Day one, Austin and Creed get started. They have no idea. They almost have no interest in knowing anything about each other. They start working together as co-workers, and you deliver. All of that sounds great, but I think there is some necessary distraction which is actually productive. It's always people, you look at distraction as something is non-productive or unproductive. I actually don't think that's the case. I think, like you mentioned at the top of the call, it's important to know people because you're working with humans for the most part, right?
Yeah.
Till Jensen Huang changes it entirely. So even at this point, we are working with humans for the most part. So knowing people, their backgrounds and their interests, likes and dislikes, goes a long way in actually being working, in being in a work environment, not to mention in a remote work environment where we don't actually see people other than through cameras. So that's why I want to know, in your projects, again, it's sometimes a lot of times dictated by the client. It depends on where the
Mhm.
power is. Is it with the client or with the vendor? Most likely it is with the client. But again, I want to understand, get your thoughts on, uh, you know your team, you said, is mentioned in different parts of the world. What are the cultural challenges of doing, let's say we talk a little bit about APIs and we got into some level of detail there, not deep enough but not too high level either. So now you're starting to have those conversations. When you're starting to have those conversations, now you might do want to do things a certain way. Krish wants to do it maybe a little bit differently, right?
Yeah,
But you have to work together. Now, we could be clients or we could be co-workers who, maybe they're all part of the same team, or you're working with the client's resources as well, right? So you might be working with developers and engineers in your client's teams. How do you handle differences in approaches? Because there are like 10 different ways to skin the cat, some that work very well, some that may not work at all, and unfortunately the majority of them may or may not work, right? There's no black or white answer. So how do
yeah.
you maneuver and navigate those differences, engineering differences per se? uh, you can take a problem that you've run into, or you can manufacture one, be creative about it, doesn't matter. I just want to know how you would approach the solving of these different, I'm not talking about personality differences, not like human resource problems. I'm talking more about engineering,
Engineering.
philosophical differences between engineers that either you work with closely or don't work with that closely because they happen to be part of the client's teams. How do you handle those situations? And the more specific you're going to be, the more specific my follow-up questions are going to be, just to be warned there.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So one thing we do is we rotate sprints. So the Scrum Master, I guess you would say, we don't really follow Scrum, but we do something pretty close to it. And what we do is every other sprint we'll rotate out the leaders of the sprint, so the person who runs it actually changes, which would allow that person to then be able to try whatever it is that he wanted the difference in engineering. That being said, everybody on our team always has a voice, even to me. Oftentimes, we'll meet with people across the entire organization, just asking them, "Hey, what do you think I could do better to make your job more easy?" You know what I mean? Just to get everybody's opinion from there and there out. That being said, it is generally a majority rules type of thing. So I'll voice my opinion. Somebody else will voice their opinion. Somebody else will voice their opinion. But ultimately, it's majority rules of like what the team agrees on as a whole, right? And generally speaking, those ideas become really good. I mentioned earlier that we try to promote everybody in our team to be a leader and to be responsible for something. By putting everybody in a leadership position every once in a while within our team, it teaches them to be able to creatively think about these problems, to take responsibility for them and own them. And when something goes wrong, it also teaches them to take action against it going wrong and pivoting in a way that actually makes them successful, because they don't want it to fail because they're the ones in charge, right?
Right.
So it's a really, really interesting kind of dynamic. I like to think of it as like decentralized command, something that like Jocko Willink talks a lot about, and just making sure that everybody has the power that, like, if John is sick on Monday, who's the next guy? You know, everybody on the team is capable of stepping up and having a voice and being able to bring something to completion. That being said, yeah, the differences in code obviously change a little bit between like the juniors and the seniors, but the methodologies behind how they do stuff tends to be almost the same, because everybody gets to practice being a leader. Everybody gets to see the difference between somebody who does a good job and somebody who does a more or less job. It just fosters this really, really good learning environment.
Super. So, but in the context of cultural differences in
Mhm.
engineering, can you think of any examples where you're like, hey, you know what? Given, I've worked with folks in this part of the world, they solve problems a certain way, whereas this time there
Yeah.
happens to be an engineer from another part of the world that they took a very different approach to solving a similar problem. That you're like, you know what? This is interesting, and I can give you my personal examples as well. But I was just curious to know whether you've run into situations where it was interesting, or either a shock or a surprise, doesn't matter either way, where you saw remarkable differences in how the same business problem was solved differently by an engineer just because they happen to have certain different cultural backgrounds.
So I haven't noticed it as much, like in the engineering and the coding itself, but I have noticed it when it comes to like more HR stuff, how people interact with each other, how people talk to each other, how people communicate just in general, whether or not they're on time or not. I do notice those cultural differences, yes, but not so much on the engineering part.
Okay, and when you notice those cultural differences, are there situations where uh, they are challenging, or is it mostly like, you know what, you've done this long enough to be like, yeah, it's not a big deal?
I don't think I've done it long enough. I still have a lot to learn. I'm gonna be honest with that. That being said, yeah, we've had some challenges for sure, and some things we've kind of gotten used to and we've kind of learned from. Um, Yeah, I mean it's just skin in the game really is what it is. You just got to keep doing it, keep working with people from different cultures. Eventually you'll learn. Some people like, hey, these type of people, they generally don't communicate that way. Other people they communicate differently, you know what I mean? And so you got to learn that. And it's also different on a personal level too, you know. Some people they are shy, you know, and maybe they're going through something and they're not being very productive and you don't know why and you got to like reach out to them and be like, "Hey man, like how's it going, man? Is everything okay? You know, like, how can I help you? You know, and then they open up all of a sudden. You're like, whoa, I had no idea that was going on. You know, but yeah, I mean, these are things you notice through time, and like I said, we're still new. I mean, we're not entirely new. We're getting close to 4 years now, but I mean, we have a lot to learn. We make mistakes for sure. Yeah,
We all do, right? Who doesn't? What do
yeah,
you tell companies that, in the US, you probably read the news, like a lot of companies are actually forcing people to come back to work. They have these beautiful offices. Uh,
yeah,
People have said that they are not super interested in actually commuting and going back necessarily, but they've been given ultimatums in many cases as well. What do you say to organizations that actually take a different point of view, from the two of us, for instance, and say that, you know what, the only way, or the best way to, not the only way, the best way to actually build software is by people physically being co-located and working the same time zones, being in the same building, for instance, right? Some
yeah.
companies, there's a fair number of them that strongly believe in that sort of an approach. I want to say, I think Musk said not too long ago that people either come to Tesla or they just don't come to work at all, or something along those lines. So
Mm.
what do you say to somebody who actually has a strong opinion to the contrary of from a remote, not doing remote work standpoint?
Well, first of all, I think it's just a different type of person. I mean, some people need that in-person structure, right? You know, me and you don't. Our team doesn't. But some people they crave. They want somebody sitting next to them. They don't feel motivated to be able to do the work sitting there at home or at a cafe or whatever, right? So, I do think that there's definitely space for in-person work. And I think it really depends on the industry and the business. It's like, well, is productivity more like, is it increased? Like, I would do a split test. I'd be like, okay, let's look at 6 months working on site, 6 months doing hybrid, and 6 months off site. How does the productivity look across those different 6 months? And why does it look that way? What are the factors that might have influenced that? Because maybe it's not that they work in person. Maybe it's that at home they can smoke cigarettes in their house, right? But
Right.
people don't think about that, you know? So there's little tiny nuances there. I don't necessarily think it's bad. I wouldn't work an in-person desk job personally. I do kind of hybrid here. I mean, me and some of the other teammates here in Argentina, we meet up together quite a lot. Generally speaking, at least once a day. But we do that because we want to,
Yeah.
right? We do that because we like working together, and it's not that we're forcing it on each other. So
Makes sense. So I think at the highest level. There's a number of those things that I want to chat about. Are there some things that you want to ask? I know I've been firing these questions, so thank you for patiently answering them. Like, are there questions that you have for me, possibly, right, about work? It doesn't have to be about work that I've done at Snowpal, but in general, are there things that you
mm,
were looking forward to ask?
yeah, I mean, we were diving deep into the APIs, so now I'm just curious on what you do to plan your APIs. So you get a manifesto from the UI team saying, "Hey, we need this." What do you guys do?
Uh, our approach. So, just to give you a background, we have a mobile app, our own mobile app in production for a while. We have a web app in production as well, and then we have our APIs, right? And those
Mhm,
are from a product standpoint, but we do a few other things as well. So our experience is generally widespread and on both sides of the stack, and it's across multiple languages and frameworks. I've mentioned this because a lot of that plays a role in a lot of the decisions that we do make. I've worked with organizations that say, build web apps all day long, all year long. Work on React, for instance, React, Relay, Redux, that space of technologies.
mhm,
Um, I've worked with companies that build APIs all day long, and that's all that they do. We are somewhere in between. There are times in the year where we are doing one entirely versus the other. But for the most part, we have to do a number of different things at the same time just because we have all of these products in production. So with that background, when we go to build an API, here is one of the first things we do. The decision comes to, hey, is this going to be a graph or REST API? And while we generally like graph, we have chosen to actually do REST in many cases because for whatever reason, years after graph has been available, it's not nearly as popular as REST is. Despite the article, I think from the REST founder that said REST is dead, like from a few years ago, it's nowhere
Yeah.
near being dead, right? So, and plus, having these API conversations, we find that talking RESTful language is easier, even if we end up actually not building it on REST. So the first thing is, okay, what are we building on REST or Graph? Let's say you go with REST just for ease of conversation here. The next thing we want to find out is, okay, I mentioned an UI page, right? Just keeping it simple. But typically it's not as simple as that because you're building an application with a number of pages. Either you're building it from ground up or you're building a brand new feature. Let's say we're building a checklist feature, which is one of the things we did not too long ago. It's been a little while, but we built checklists. Now we're building checklists for our web application. We are building a version of the checklist for our mobile app, right? So user interfaces, but two entirely different user interfaces, one built for the web, one built for the mobile app, right? It's a native mobile app on the app and play stores. And now you need to define APIs for this. Now you can go about doing this n number of ways. Here is one of the ways we do it that has worked out quite well for us. We have this conversation with the folks involved, the engineers, that saying, okay, what is this going to look like, the UI? Now, if we are a startup, so we don't have too many cycles for going from UX to UI to API to development. The first conversation, the first call with Get On, the idea is that should lead to some concrete decisions, right? It's not like, hey, we'll go to the second meeting, the third meeting, and it's like 10 meetings before we get somewhere. At the end of the first meeting, we have a pretty darn good idea as to what it is that this checklist feature is going to look like. And given that all of us are engineers, unfortunately, we do sometimes the wrong thing, which is try to even design the API by going to Google Chrome, the style sheet, the inspector, and get the UI looking the way we want for it to look to some extent. It's not a high level wireframe or a markup. It's actually something that is partly functional, right? You're on Chrome, you're on the inspector, you start designing this. Now we come to an agreement saying this is how the checklist is going to look like. Now we may go to the mobile app, we may not go to it, but the idea here is the entire team across the board have a good fundamental understanding of what it is that we are actually doing there. The second part of that meeting's conversation often leads to what endpoints there should be. Now, if it's graph, it's a single endpoint, it's post, and you have to do it through queries and mutations. But if it's REST, it's what are the actual endpoints that we need to define here. We start discussing those endpoints in those initial calls, right? The first one, definitely in the second one, if not the first one. We write them down. What should those URLs look like? What should the HTTP verb be? And to some extent, what the response might be. Now, we don't want to design the entire JSON exchange necessarily in those initial first conversation, but we have an idea. So when the API team goes, they know what those endpoints should look like, and they start working on defining the JSON exchange. Here is the response. Here is the request. Here are what the HTTP headers. Here is what the headers should look like. What the authorization should. What is the security exchange that needs to happen here? What is the API key? Is there an API key? Sometimes in doing backend to backend requests, you may or may not have those API keys, but if it's coming from a client, we need those API keys. So we go to that level of detail to define that parent high level specification. And then we start publishing that specification on Postman and share it with the team members. Now, in the first meeting or the second meeting, Austin, you have a pretty good picture as to what this checklist feature is going to look like. The UI and the UX may not be ironed out. That can change. But if that changes, it has no impact on the API team, right? So the only thing we're interested here is what should that specification very look like. I mean, we want to make sure it's 80% of the way there, because what happens is if it's too loose, the API team starts building it, the UI team starts building it, and then you start making a tiny change to your JSON exchange. It looks like a tiny change, but sometimes it fundamentally changes the way your design works. And we don't want for that to happen. Now, if you're changing the name of an attribute, that's not a big deal, right? It's very simple. But what we try to avoid is the fundamentals of that contractual exchange between the UI and the API team should stay pretty much intact. If it doesn't, you can go redo it. Now, I'm not saying that it's not like government project where it's etched in stone and we have to go through 10 levels of approval and bureaucracy to getting things done. But at the same time, there needs to be some level of structure. I've seen in startups where, in the interest of moving quickly, you end up moving in the wrong direction. Now, the problem is, if you end up, if you move quickly and in the wrong direction, you're actually not really moving quickly, right? You're actually moving quickly in the wrong direction, which means you're just losing time and money, right? So
Yeah.
we try to be careful there, because whatever it is that you're doing, it should be small enough and concrete enough that it's made available, to the teams for to be consumed and for changes to come into play, right? At least that's at the highest level how we go about. But one more thing I would add here is sprints. Now, you mentioned sprints. I want to ask you, before I give you my opinion as well there, what is your take, Austin, on the value of sprints? Like, how long are your
Mm.
sprints? Like 2 weeks long, or is it like 3 weeks? What is your sprint typically?
We
What does it?
actually do 1 week sprints.
Wow,
Yeah,
even shorter. Okay.
but really, really small features. I think sprints are not always useful, to be quite frank. I think that for bigger, more complex projects, they definitely help a lot, especially really complex features where it's like it's gonna take like even weeks to see progress. I mean, to visually see the progress,
Right.
right? It's really good to track and make sure that things are getting done week by week, which is really good. When it comes to simpler projects, I think that it's a little overkill, to be honest.
I love it. I couldn't be happier to hear that, because that's literally what I was going to say as well. But I'm going to tell you why I think it's an overkill. But before I say that, in your opinion, what are some of the things you feel like, hey, it's not really adding the value it's supposed to be adding?
Well, first of all, it adds a lot of responsibility on a lot of people. And so there's a lot of meetings that get added due to the sprints, things like that. Instead of just like getting a quick update on the project, all of a sudden there's like, okay, we have to run through everybody and say what we did well, what we didn't do well, which is all good because I mean you grow. But I mean on a simple project where it's like, I don't know, like a 4-page project, just something simple, subscribe page, a couple simple automations, right? It's just too much. You know what I mean? I mean the entire project all is honestly like 4 to 6 sprints.
No, I know exactly what you mean, right? So that, would part of it be, here is my pain point. I'm not a fan of it for many reasons. One of it is the ceremonies associated with the notion of sprint. I think
Yeah.
sometimes they become endless and painful. Like, you have
Oh
the
yeah.
retrospective, you have the grooming sessions, you have, there's no not an end to it at all, because when it's a 2 week sprint, Austin, you feel like, the first day of the sprint you're spending time on certain ceremonies, the middle of the sprint you're spending time on some other ceremonies, and then at the end of the sprint you're doing the demo and ending at the ceremonies, and you feel like 20% of your actual 2 weeks was gone just appeasing the requirements of the sprints and agile as an approach to building software.
Yeah, so when I said that we kind of follow Scrum, but we don't exactly follow Scrum, what that meant was we'll set goals at the beginning of the week, like, hey, this is what we'd like to see by the end of the week, blah, 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 you know? And then if it's a really complex project, we'll do a quick 15-minute meetup every day. But that meetup is not, it's just to say, hey, how's everybody doing? Does anybody need help? How can I make your job easy? You know what I mean? And that's it. And then at the end of the week, we'll do the review. And at that point, we'll be like, okay, well, where's everybody at on these features? Blah blah blah. We'll make sure there's no blockers throughout the week as well. That is one thing. Um, and then we'll do a little bit of code review. We do code review every 2 weeks, so not every week because code review is quite a long process. Um,
And is it
but
one-on-one code reviews, or is a bunch of people reviewing the code?
we do a little bit of both. So our CTO and the guys do a one-on-one code review once every 2 weeks, just individually with him, and then once every 2 weeks, everybody needs to show one piece of code as a group within the project that they are proud of to the entire
Okay.
group. So it's
And
kind of
what
oh hey, look what I built this week.
lovely, right? And
Yeah.
very motivational as well. But if you were to say one or two things about what someone should not look for in a code review, like in other words, if somebody's reviewing code and actually spending time doing some things that are actually not going to be productive at all, what would one or two of those things be? Like in your experience, when somebody's reviewing code or when you're reviewing code, what are things you try to avoid because you're like, you know what, I could go down this rabbit hole, but that's not going to make the most, that's not the best use of my time reviewing this code.
Well, I mean, it kind of depends on the type of project. There are some projects where you need the best performing possible code, the highest quality code ever. That's like maybe 10% of projects. The other 90% of projects, you just kind of need something that works that doesn't have bugs, right? And
Right.
so by keeping that in mind, if you need something that works that doesn't have bugs, well, then at that point it's like, well, that works, but this way is a little faster by X amount of seconds. Like, yeah, okay, but that really bring? I mean, you can mention to him maybe, and he'll get a little bit better, but going down and changing the entire app to follow that, you know, that type of thinking doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when this is just an MVP that the client wants to throw at the market just to see if it works anyway, right?
Makes sense. And then when you share your feedback with the team, what is the culture that you prefer? Not necessarily what you follow. Would you be like, would you like to be somebody who says, Krish, what you wrote doesn't really make much sense and it doesn't look pretty either? I think you should change it. Or do you find yourself relying heavily on euphemisms where you might say, "Hey, Krish, you know what? This thing looks good. You've done a great job, but it would be nice if you were to change this so it does X, Y, and Z." You know that the type of language I'm making it quite obvious there, but I want to know where you've
Mm.
seen productivity. Is it more like, Krish, this doesn't make sense. Can you change it? Or using a lot more words, being nice, and then trying to get the message across?
Definitely number two. That being said, some newer engineers, when they first come on, they'll do something that really doesn't make sense. And generally speaking, like at least there's some good in the code, and we can be like, hey, this is great, this is great. This maybe we could do differently. I might even sit down, not me much more Mateos, he's much smarter than me. Um, he'll sit down and he'll be like, hey, this might be a little bit better way of doing said thing. Or we'll ask them constructive questions, be like, okay, so imagine this situation. What do you think would happen if this situation occurred given the code that you've written? And then gives them a little bit thinking ahead, teaching them how to problem solve so that in the future, instead of just because it's one thing to teach someone how to write code, it's another thing to teach them how to think of problems before they happen,
Absolutely.
right? And so we always try to encourage that type of thinking. But yeah, definitely we always pick out things that are really good. But if the code is just totally bad, we're like, hey, why don't we sit down together and work some of these problems out together? We'll code a little bit, we'll explain a little bit, we'll have them code a little bit in front of us. You discuss their thinking to try to level them up as a team member.
I think that makes sense. We are at almost an hour. I'm happy to answer any other questions you have as well about anything that we do, whether it's engineering related, architecture related, product management. Having just done this for a while, and again, we are a startup, so we do a number of things from a software development standpoint, but we do things outside of that as well. For the first time, we've learned how to prospect, how to reach out to people on LinkedIn. Things that were not it's not a natural habitat as engineers, right? You have to kind of
Yeah.
force yourself doing things that may or may not come naturally to you. So I'm just mentioning those. If you are curious to know of any of those things, I'm happy to answer if you have any questions, uh, or if not, we're good as well. Do you have any other questions you'd like to ask?
No, man. I mean, the only thing I'm curious about is how long you guys have been in operation.
We launched our first product, like we went live with our product in 2019. That's us as a product company, right?
Yeah.
But we've been around as a company forever. We used to, we do consulting as well. That's one
Okay.
of the things we do, right? The idea is to go do consulting, make some money, put all of the money and more on your product, right? That's
Yeah.
typically our cycle.
Yeah.
So personally, I've been doing this for, I don't know, like 20 some years. I've been building software
Yeah.
for 20 some years. Uh, the company is, I want to say, like 14 years old, maybe, maybe more than 14 years, or give or take. But the first of the products that got launched was the web app, which was in 2019. And then we followed that closely with a mobile app. And then we've been publishing our APIs. And so that's sort of where
Mm,
we are at. And our stack, again, if you need to know more, I'm happy to explain. Our stack spans a spectrum. We work on Ruby, we work on Rails, and we work on other Ruby frameworks outside of Rails. We are predominantly on AWS. We have our Lambdas, our API gateways on AWS. Our
okay.
APIs are built on many APIs are built on Golang. We fell in love with Golang a couple of years ago. Since
Mm,
then, a lot of our API work, is heavily dependent on Golang. Our mobile app is a native app. Essentially, it's available on the app and Play stores. So on any given day, when you look at our code, we're looking at a code as engineers, not so much as developers of that language, and that adds to a lot of challenges as well.
mhm.
But this is our podcast we're publishing, so it's me asking questions. The next time you can fire away all of your questions. I'm more than happy to answer. If I know, I'll say I know. If I don't know, I don't know. But that's, yeah, long answer, short answer. The product's 5 years. The company is a lot older than that.
That's beautiful, man. Yeah, definitely have a lot to learn from you then, for sure.
Oh, same here as well. And again, I'll include links to you, to your profile. Please send us your links. I'll have the team included.
Yeah, yeah.
Your links to your organization. So when we publish it, all of that will be available for folks to be able to, connect and reach out to you. I think this was great. We talked about a number of different things. It's an hour, but we've spoke of a variety of different things, right? Again, thank you very much, Austin Reed. Again, everybody, I'm going to include Austin's links, contact information on the podcast. So please feel free to reach out to Austin, uh, or if you want me to make a connection, I'm happy to do that as well. Uh, Anything else, Austin, as closing words, or should we call it wraps here?
No, I think that was great. Again, I appreciate being part of the podcast. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, folks. Talk to you soon.